Mark chapter 5, we will jump right in starting in verse 1 to remind us of where we are in the text because, as is the nature of trying to get through Mark in the period of time we're not going to hit everything that comes along. And so the thing that just happened is Jesus stilling the storm, which I love that story. At the same time, that story is actually in all the Gospels, and so sometimes that's an easy one to skip in one or another, so we skipped it for that reason. We'll come back to it again, I'm sure, in another Gospel. But this is what has happened just now for Jesus. He has been in the boat asleep. There was a great storm that came up. The disciples were all freaking out, not knowing what to do, and they were concerned about their lives. When the fishermen get concerned in a storm, there's a problem. And Jesus stands up and says, "Peace, be still," and the storm is calmed. And everyone is just amazed and maybe a little fearful by what has happened. And then they reach shore, and it says that in verse 1 of chapter 5, they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. Now, to you and I, the country of the Gerasenes probably doesn't mean a whole lot, but if you were to look and kind of research this, you learn a few things. It's over kind of on the eastern side of the sea, near probably the southeastern side there, somewhere near the Jordan River also, and is likely Gentile territory. And there are a lot of reasons why people think this. Some of it's just historical and archaeological. Some of it is we're going to run into pig herders here in a little bit. And so either they're really bad at being Jews or they're Gentiles, one of the two. So people tend to think as Gentiles. Some think based on how this demon-possessed man addresses Jesus, that might be a part of it, although we could argue about if it's the man who's addressing Jesus or the demons within the man who are addressing Jesus, or if that changes at some point during the story, and we won't get off in the weeds on that. But for whatever reasons we see, this is likely a Gentile area that Jesus has come into. And there's a significance to that because for the average Jew, this is a place you wouldn't want to go. This is a place you wouldn't want to be around them, and you certainly wouldn't want to have a whole lot of conversation, and you also wouldn't think of these as people who, religiously speaking, are teachable. Because God's chosen people in that day and time are the Jews, and they don't really get along with the Gentiles all that well. And for Jesus to go to this group is just kind of the beginning of opening our eyes to what Jesus is going to do. When we get to the very end of Jesus' time on earth, it's clear that he wants the word about him to spread not just to the Jews, but out into the world, to the Gentiles too. And we have little moments in the Gospels where he does that himself, to kind of begin to open their eyes to that idea. So he comes to the country of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. I don't know if you have ever been in a spot where you encountered a person that very quickly made you really, really uncomfortable. I've had moments like that in life where, I was actually telling somebody a story the other day about, we were in Jamaica on a mission trip. I always feel bad saying I was in Jamaica on a mission trip. There is a touristy side of Jamaica, and then there is more the third world side of Jamaica. We were on that side. And as we were there, we had discovered that within walking distance from the place where we were, there was a shopping area, and there in that shopping area, there was a Popeyes. And for growing up in South Alabama guy trying to eat Jamaican food for several days, the thought of a Popeyes within walking distance was just glorious. And so there were 4 or 5 of us that decided we wanted to go find some fried chicken, and we started walking down the road. And as we were walking along, an old Volkswagen bus, you remember those, the old Volkswagen vans, drove by us pretty quickly and then stopped probably about, a couple hundred yards away from us. And then the door slung open, and we saw a guy begin to get out who had a machine gun of some kind in his hand. And I thought, I like chicken, but not quite this much. And so we quickly turned around and started walking back the way we came, and we never got our Popeyes, and all was fine. I was wanting to be anywhere other than that. Or sometimes you encounter somebody where there's just kind of a social issue of some kind where you feel like you're maybe not completely safe. I remember talking one time to a guy who'd come in the church office asking for help, and midway through our conversation, he took out his knife and began to sharpen it, a big knife, and began to sharpen it, and then began shaving the hair on his arm with it as we were talking. And I thought, I want to be helpful, and I want to be kind and compassionate and all of that. At the same time, I'm mildly frightened right now and not knowing exactly what's going on. As Jesus gets out of the boat, and this guy comes up who is described here as out of the tombs and with an unclean spirit. Could imagine what that's like for these disciples especially who have just witnessed storm that they were fearful about, Jesus having power over that, and they don't know quite what to do with that yet. And now here comes this guy. I love Mark's constant use of immediately throughout the book because it's like you don't have time to catch your breath and then another thing happens. And then Mark continues to describe him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. So the way he's described here, he's possessed by a demon, which that alone is enough. But beyond that, he lived among the tombs. It's one thing to go and visit. It's one thing to have a purpose to be there or to remember a loved one or have those kind of just special moments where you may go there. But to live there and to be among that constantly was kind of an unusual thing, especially for these Jewish men getting off the boat who found these kinds of things unclean. Then it says that he could not be bound. And the way that Mark says it is, he was often put in shackles because they were trying. The community around them who was frightened, they wanted to at least contain this guy somehow. But he could not be bound. He had incredible physical strength because he was breaking these chains. That's not something the average person does, and yet he does. And then we learn that he's constantly kind of crying out. And during the night is the way that Mark describes it. We in our neighborhood have a dog that barks all night long. Not mine, by the way, but there's a dog somewhere. We still haven't figured out who he belongs to. He barks all night long. And once you kind of settle down and things are quiet, it's the only thing you hear. Or if you live out in the country, you may hear the howling of the coyotes that begins all night long. And if you are, in your bed, comfy and all safe in your house, that sounds fine. If you were out in the woods with no weapon and no way to defend yourself, that might sound a little bit different. And then we learn that he is doing self-harm. He's cutting himself. So here is a guy who is going through all of these different things, who is the one who approaches Jesus. And if you were want to encounter somebody and talk to them about Jesus, you may have a picture of somebody in your mind of who that would be. This is probably not the picture. This is incredibly uncomfortable and unusual and maybe a little bit frightening. And here this guy comes with all of these things going on. And it says when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him. He ran. We see videos from time to time of someone who's has a child who, we would see these a lot growing up in Alabama near the Gulf, where someone's child had gotten a little too far off into the Gulf, and they would come running them back in to try to find someone who could help. Or maybe you've seen a video of someone who's called 911 and the police come to the house and they are running to the police for safety. This man sees Jesus from afar and runs. And again, the commentators disagree a little bit about, is this at this point in the story the demons that are causing this man to run toward Jesus because they know what could happen and the power that Jesus had? Or is it the man who sees the possibility of something running toward Jesus? And we really don't know. There are times I read this story and I see either one of those things. The demons understanding that they're going to do whatever they can to try to get ahead of this situation. Or maybe the man who realizes all of this time in the tombs and being an outcast and even hurting himself sees the possibility of something different. And I think you could probably read this story either way, and that would probably be okay. Whichever way you see it, he doesn't want to wait for Jesus to get to him. He runs to Jesus. Then, in verse 7, it says, crying aloud with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he was saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Now, it's interesting to me the way he addresses Jesus. Jesus, Son of the Most High God. We to this point in Mark have had a lot of times where Jesus has had an encounter with somebody where their life has changed, and Jesus will basically respond with, "Don't go tell anybody about this. Keep this to yourself. Just, kind of go on with life." And we have a lot of people who see Jesus and they're amazed or they're fearful or they don't know what to do. Here, as this demon-possessed man approaches, the demons likely say to him, "Jesus, Son of the Most High God." Now, as I mentioned, just prior to this, at the end of chapter 4, we had Jesus stilling the storm. In contrast, the way the demons mention who Jesus is to what the disciples say after the storm was stilled. They were filled with great fear and said to one another, Jesus, the Most High God? I mean, isn't that the reaction it should be? Jesus, Son of the Most High God? Instead, they say, who is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? Their response is, who is this? While the demons respond very differently with, Jesus, Son of the Most High God. They know who this is. And they say to Jesus, this is Jesus, the Son of the Most High God. So Jesus asked him, verse 9, what is your name? And he replied, my name is Legion, for we are many. If you care about such things, a legion, depending on which commentator or historian you believe, is somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,000 to 6,000 Roman troops. We don't know if this means that there are 4,000 to 6,000 demons within this guy. A lot of people kind of take that step. Could be. But what we do learn is there are clearly a lot of demons within this guy. He says, my name is Legion, for we are many. And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. So these demons within this man, they know something about Jesus, not just that he's Son of the Most High God, but that he can do something to them that has been undoable to this point. Because remember, they've tried to bind this guy and it's not worked. They've tried to get him away from them, and clearly he's still encountering people because they keep trying to bind him, and he breaks the binds and the chains. So now a great herd of pigs, verse 11, was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him, saying, send us to the pigs, let us enter them. Now, why this is their plan, I have no idea. Commentators don't get into this a whole lot, trying to figure out exactly what this is about, but their thought is just send us there. So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea. There are a lot of things that happen in Scripture that I just can't imagine exactly what that would have looked like. I used to say when I was a youth minister that I hoped that when I got to heaven there was like a big DVD library. Now no one knows what DVDs are anymore, but anyhow, a streaming library now, I guess, where you could see what this stuff looked like. I can't imagine the sight of 2,000 pigs running down this hill and into the sea. And we could argue a little bit about why on earth this is the way it went about, and I don't know exactly. But I think largely to see happen what's going to happen next. Because next what we're going to see is the people's reaction. There's a lot of commotion obviously going on. We don't get a feel for exactly how far removed from people all of this is going on, but there's a lot happening, and 2,000 pigs going into the sea is not something that you see every day. So it says the herdsmen fled. So these guys are there keeping the pigs. They fled, and they told it in the city and in the country. And people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had the legion, sitting there clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. Now, I'm not 100% sure which thing they're afraid of or if it's all of it, but they know now that these pigs have apparently had the demons go into them, run down, and they've all drowned, and they're fearful. Or they see someone who has never been in his right mind that they can remember. And here he is sitting there clothed and in his right mind. And I'm not sure what the difference looks like exactly, but it's apparent to them that there's something very different about this guy. And they understand there is a power that is completely out of their control who's here. These people who have felt like they're at least somewhat in charge, even when they can't bind this guy, they can at least put him out in the tombs and get him away from them. These people who are keeping the pigs and going on with their lives, suddenly there's something that has upended all of that. And we oftentimes in the world today are at the opposite end of the spectrum, where we feel like we are completely in control, and yet we're not. We feel like we can fix everything, make everything the way we want it to be, grab the reins, do what we want, and we are just not fully in control. For them, they have a moment where they can't deny it. And for us, too often, we just don't see it, and yet it's the same thing. God is still in control. So first of all, they're afraid. Now, it's interesting to me that fear is the reaction, because I want the reaction to at least be partially what the disciples had back at the storming of the sea, or the stilling of the storm, because they're afraid, but they're also amazed. And they should be amazed at least a little bit at the fact that here is a guy who was completely out of control, yesterday. And now here he sits looking like any of the rest of us. And how did that happen? So first of all, they're fearful. And then secondly, it said those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs. And they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. So first of all, they're afraid. And then secondly, they asked him to leave. They don't know exactly what is going on. They're fearful about it, and they don't want any more of it. And for so many people, this is kind of the reaction to things of God. We're either fearful of it, or maybe we just don't want anything to do with it, and so we push it away. That thread I was mentioning to you this morning on the Facebook group about the witches group, there are people who are Christians who are in there saying we're going to pray, and the people who just want their witches group just want to push those Christians away and be done with any of that. And maybe sometimes you feel like that in life, that when you want to bring things of God into the conversation, people just don't want to hear that anymore. Or when you tell somebody that you're praying for them or about something, they don't want that like maybe they did 10, 20, 30 years ago. Maybe we feel a little more like these guys involved in this story. So they just want Jesus to leave. But then we see the man's reaction, and it's a little bit different. Could you imagine for a minute if you were this guy? And I know it's so hard for us, but if you were one who was not in control of what you were doing, and maybe you feel out of control sometimes, and maybe you feel like there are people who have more authority and power than you, and they're actually running whatever, but at a whole different level of you're not controlling your movements, you're not controlling where you're at, you're not controlling how people interact with you, and then all of society just wants to push you to the side so they don't have to deal with you. You're kind of an outcast. And then this man, Jesus, gets off a boat near the place where you are, has a conversation with the demons who are within you, and now suddenly you are in your right mind, and you are clothed, and you're sitting there watching this entire argument go on. How do you feel during all of that? And I think the way the man reacts is what I like to think would be the way that most of us would react. It says, as he, Jesus, was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. So instead of being fearful, this man asked to go with him. And maybe asked is a little too light because the way the text puts it is he begged him to go with him. He just wants, and maybe there's a piece of it that he wants to escape the place that he's been and leave that behind. But I think probably more than that, it's the fact that here is a man who has changed his life, and I just want to grab on. I don't want to let go of him. So he begged to be with him. But he did not permit him, verse 19, but said to him, go home to your friends and tell them about how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. The amazement came a little late, didn't it? You know, you want the amazement just in that moment from the first people that come up. They're fearful, they want to get rid of Jesus. But Jesus tells this man to go and tell the story, and he didn't have to tell him twice. Tell them what has happened. Tell them what has been done for you. And he goes and he tells. He told everyone about what Jesus had done. So for you and me, as we read this story about a guy who's possessed by a demon out by the tombs 2,000 years ago almost, what does it mean for us? What about us? And it's so easy for us to look at this and see a whole group of people that is nothing like us, and we don't understand, and they're in a very different place. And yet think about the words of Paul in Ephesians chapter 2. Paul says, and you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature children of wrath like the rest of mankind. We were once, as Paul describes, dead in sin. We're in the tombs. We're out there. We were following the world. There's a way the world wants to live, a set of values the world wants to have, and then something that God has for us. And how often do we get caught up in the wrong one? How often do we find ourselves with the wrong goals, the wrong focus? We were following evil, or as he says, the prince of the power of the air, which is Satan. We don't think a whole lot about Satan, and generally if you think about someone who's following Satan nowadays, you're thinking of Satanists and pentagrams and all of those cultish kinds of things. And yet for them, they weren't necessarily doing that either. What they were doing was following the way that Satan might lead or the way that he might tempt us. And Satan is still very active in our world. And when we follow evil, we're actually following the way that Satan would have us to go. We were led by the flesh. All of the indulgences, all of the things that we just desperately want in our flesh, we were led by those. And we were children of wrath. And we wouldn't describe ourselves in that way. And yet so much of what the world and Satan leads us to is so far away from the good and the love of God and towards the wrath of the other side of things. But then in verse 4, he says this, "But God, being rich in mercy, because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved." We have been given life, just like this demon-possessed man who was there among the tombs, who was out of control of his own life. He was given another opportunity to live a full and whole and good and free life. And what is his reaction when he does that? He wants to latch onto Jesus and get as close as he can, which I hope is something we want to do today. And then he wants to go out and tell everyone else about it. I love the fact that the word that is used in Greek for this man going out and proclaiming to everyone about what Jesus had done is the word kerusso. If you were a high school student and you went to Harding to their preaching camp is called kerusso because it's the Greek word for preach. This demon-possessed man went out and began to preach. He began to tell everyone the good news about what he had done. And if you think there was ever a person who would not know all the answers to the questions, that's the guy. Think there was ever a person who felt a little bit awkward getting into situations with other people he had not been around for who knows how long? That's the guy. And yet he goes out and he tells the story. This morning, that's the question for us. How do we react? Are we people that latch onto Jesus and then go and tell? Or are we people that are fearful or run or seek another way? How are we going to react to Jesus today? And if you have never followed him, that's the question for you this morning. Are you going to be one who reacts to Jesus by following, by latching on, by confessing his name, by being baptized into him and having your life changed? Or are you going to be somebody who just walks out of here and it's another day? Or if whatever has taken you away, I don't expect it's demon possession and being in the tombs and being tried to chain down, but there are a lot of people who move away for a lot of different reasons. If you have moved away from God, it's an opportunity for you to come back because he wants you to have life, and as John tells us in his gospel, to have it abundantly. Not just here, but in heaven forever. If there's some way we can help you to come to him for the first time or to come back to him, please come while we stand and sing.